Welcome to Coyote's Corner. This episode, we'll be listening to Debra Ballou tell a true story, The Volunteer.
Rain drummed on the barn roof, high over my head, as I pulled leaves of hay from the bale closest to me, throwing it down the chute to the horses below. I could hear them shifting in their stalls. Those 2 leaves of hay that I've thrown down were not enough food for them that morning, so I walked over to the bale of hay closest to me and reached out to grab the twine to hoist it up to bring it to the chute. Raindrops fell on my hands and on my head, and I looked up, and I could see that the roof was leaking above me. And as I looked across that loft, I could see other places where the rain was coming down, and I dropped the bale near the chute, and I ran down the stairs from the loft to the woodshed and into the first shed closest to the house and in through the kitchen door. I yelled, "Dad, Dad, the barn roof's leaking, come quick." We went back out through the sheds and up into the loft. And sure enough, every part of the roof near the peak and in a few other places was leaking. For the next 2 to 3 hours, we were moving bales of hay, restacking them so that they wouldn't get wet, for wet hay was moldy hay, and moldy hay was no good for horses. After we were done, we went back to the house. My dad got on the phone to Mr. Hughes and called him to come and help to reshingle the barn when the sun had returned and when their schedules could connect. The day came and Mr. Hughes drove into the yard in his old green rattletrap truck, pulled out his tools, and he and Dad stood in the driveway discussing what needed to be done to the barn and how they were going to do it. And they kept talking about the volunteer was going to have to climb the roof so that they could throw a rope up and have it secured so that they could then put the scaffolding up. Well, my father and mother both being Marines, you didn't volunteer, you were volunteered. And for this particular job, I was the volunteer. My father wanted me to climb the barn roof, and once at the peak, he would throw the rope up to me. I would haul up and throw the bit end over the side to Mr. Hughes, who would be standing at the back of the barn. We got the 8-foot wood ladder and put it up against the woodshed as Mr. Hughes went around the backside of the barn. And as I was looking up at that barn roof, I'm thinking, oh man, that's high. That is really, really high. Now, my mother was not too excited about this project and that I was going to be climbing that barn roof. And she had objected to my father and over again, and my father kept saying, she'll be fine. She knows what to do, she'll be fine. And my mother wanted to know why it was that my brother wasn't climbing the barn roof. And my father looked at her and he says, he's too young, he's more than 3 years younger than her, he's just too young. She can do it, she'll be fine. So as we're standing looking up at the roof of that barn, I said to Dad, Dad, can't we find some other way to do this? My father looked at me and says, aren't you the girl that would go on any carnival ride imaginable since the age of 5? And aren't you that same girl who will climb any tree, no matter how tall it is? And aren't you that same girl who would climb up to the tallest, highest loft in your grandparents' barn and jump off into the air and land in the piled up loose hay on the barn floor? Yeah, Dad, I am that girl. But there's always something to hang on to. There's nothing to hang on to in a barn roof. My father looked at me and says, just remember, lean forward and don't look down, and you'll be fine. So my father laced his fingers together and put his hands out for me to step up onto them, to hoist me up onto the barn as if he was hoisting me up onto the back of a horse. And there I was on the edge of the roof of the barn, on my knees and my hands, feeling the grit biting into my skin on my hands and through the jeans and into my knees. And I began climbing. Higher and higher I went. And just about 3/4 of the way up the barn roof, I began sliding. It seems that gravity had taken over friction and I was sliding faster and faster. And I could hear my father, who was standing on the shed roof below, saying, "Lean forward!" And not wanting to look back at him, I yelled, "I am leaning forward!" The shingles were going past my eyes so quickly, and if I had leaned any further forward, I would have been scraping my nose on the shingles. And as I'm getting further down the roof, getting closer and closer to that edge, I could hear my father, "Don't worry, I'll catch you." Fortunately, we didn't have to test out that theory that day, for friction took over gravity, and I stopped sliding. I began climbing again, and this time I made it all the way to the peak of the roof. I straddled the peak as if I was on the back of a horse. My legs were trembling, my arms were shaking, and my breath was heavy. I couldn't have stood up in that moment if you'd paid me all the money in the world. The voice of my father came up to me saying, "We got work to do." And I could see that Mr. Hughes was looking up towards me, and I turned and faced the direction my father was on the other side. As I did, I could see out over the hillside and across the valley into the hills on the other side, and the apple orchard was in full bloom, and it was the most magnificent sight. But there was work to do, and my father was coiling up the rope and getting it ready to swing out over his head and throw up to me, and he swung the rope harder and harder and harder, and then he let it go, and it sailed through the air up towards me. Well, it was just too far out to reach for it. I didn't want to tumble off the roof. The rope fell back down to my father, and he gathered it up, and he prepared to throw it up to me again, and he yelled up, "You gotta reach for it." Well, that next time that he threw it, it came in close enough that I felt that it was okay to reach and grab it. I grabbed hold and I pulled up a long length of it, and then I threw the bit end down over the back to Mr. Hughes, where he secured it, tied it firmly. My father tied it on the front side, and I was able to grab hold of that rope and hand over hand lower myself back down to the shed roof. Well, the years went by, and at one of those family get-togethers, as often happens when you're sitting around talking to each other, and the history of the family, the stories come up, and I don't know exactly why I thought of it that day, but my mother and I were sitting peeling potatoes at the kitchen table. I said, "Mom, you remember that time I had to climb the barn roof when Dad and Mr. Hughes had to shingle it?" Well, that was still a sore spot with my mother after all the years had gone by, and she started sputting, "Oh, those men, I can't believe they had you do that." I said, "Well, Mom, why is it exactly that I had to climb that barn roof and not Dad?" She looked at me. She said, "Well, don't you know?" I said, "No, what?" "Your father's afraid of heights."
That was Debra Ballou telling The Volunteer. Michael Lang sat down with Debra to get some background on that story and see where it came from. We'll listen to that interview now.
Thank you, Deb, for coming in and sharing that story with us.
Oh, thanks, Mike, for inviting me. I'm glad to do it for you.
Absolutely. Now, this is a true story. I've only heard you tell a couple of true stories. Why do you tell this one?
Well, this story has a lot of meaning to me because the day that I had to climb that barn roof, I just didn't think that it was possible to go up that steep incline and come back alive, even though my father kept saying it was not that big of a deal. And ever since then, any tough challenges that I've come across, I think about it and I think, if I could climb that barn roof, I can do this. This is not that big of a deal. And in the age of people telling more and more true stories or personal stories rather than just folk tales, fairy tales, and other genres. That one was the first one that I worked on for telling to people instead of just sharing them with friends and family.
I've heard you tell this story a couple of times. What sorts of places have you told this story?
Mostly I've told them to adult audiences, usually at the Corner House Inn in Cinder Sandwich, New Hampshire, where I perform once or twice a year. Occasionally at other adult venues, dinner venues, or for special events, nonprofit events.
As we were getting ready to record today, you were talking about how you sometimes end the story with a little bit more to it, sometimes you don't. Do you feel like you've found the ending yet, or are you still working on how to end this story?
I think that this actually is a work in progress. I have a couple of different endings that I've interchanged with it, and I am still working on the final title. But for right now, the version that I've shared with you today is mostly the way I've been telling it. The other version would be more about the reaction of my father walking into the kitchen that day when he heard my mother telling me that he was afraid of heights and him saying, "I'm not afraid of heights." And then including in about my looking at life very differently from that point on. So it's still something I think about is what's the true ending, but when you tell something that happens to you that you've lived, there's always more to it than what you choose to share with other people.
Are there things that make you decide whether you're going to share more of the story or not when you're telling it to an audience?
Typically it depends on what else I'm telling for the evening, who I'm telling it to, the venue that I'm in. And I don't really want to tell the kind of story where people feel like you're beating them over the head with the moral of the story.
Sure.
So I play with it a little bit here and there, depending on who is in the audience and how long I have to work with.
Well, thank you for coming to Coyote's Corner and sharing the current version of The Volunteer with us.
Thank you, Mike.
That was Michael Lang sitting down with Debra Ballou to discuss her story, The Volunteer. If you'd like to hear more about Debra, find out more about her and her storytelling, check out her website, debraballou.com. To our listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe so you never miss a minute of what's going on here. And until next time, this has been Coyote's Corner.